Hello and welcome back. It is an honor and privilege to have you here. This is Paolo, your host, and this is another conversation in artificial intelligence. So today we're going to take a broader look on what it takes to build innovative and successful products in the field of artificial intelligence. And this is going to be not only very interesting, but very educational for quite a bit of you guys. So with us today, we have an innovator, a product manager, and somebody who's had a very diversified career. Michael Fox, the Director of Product Management and Innovation at Interlink. Hi, Michael. How are you today?
I'm doing very well. How are you today?
I am super good, and thank you so much for being here.
Oh, I'm very happy to be here. Excited to talk about some of these topics.
Okay, but before we do that, let's tell the world a little bit about yourself. So what brought you to AI?
At Intralinks, we make software that runs mergers and acquisitions. And if you imagine the amount of board level content and all of the security when you're buying and selling, we're a security and a collaboration company. And a couple of years ago, we asked the question, what would AI mean for our clients, for deal makers? What are the opportunities that exist? And that's really where I began a deep look at artificial intelligence in terms of how you actually build products. And one of the things that's unique about our business is we actually don't own the data. So the data belongs to the customers. We secure that data. It's very, very confidential. It's very hard to look at. So I began my AI journey actually with how do you build AI when you don't have access to the data, you don't own the data? How do you actually get started? So it was a big challenge in the very beginning.
Tell us a little bit about what happened before Interlink and how did you get here? If you were to tell your high school friends what Michael has done in the last 15 years.
So in the last 20 years, I actually started in the data center building networks at internet providers when telecommunications in the United States became deregulated. And I worked my way up to a very high end of technology, architecture, and engineering with cloud and multi-tenant SaaS companies. Wrote a book. And then I decided, look, I need to go back to school. So I got a master's degree in business and a master's in finance. And I went into the business side of technology. So I learned how to sell. I learned how to do marketing. And that brought me to the last 6-7 years where I've done product. And I've been focusing on building products either in multi-tenant SaaS or security or building products and solutions.
What do you think is the value of keeping learning, keeping doing new things in the career of a person?
I think a couple things. So the first is that the technology is always changing, and it doesn't matter if you're on the business side or you're on the technology side. When you look at how things evolve, you have a choice, and you can stay involved for 10 or 15 years through the entire cycle of a technology, or you can choose to adapt and grow. And what I found is that when you start to get strong in multiple technical areas, your value in the marketplace and just the types of projects you get to work on are much more interesting. So myself, I have a background in SaaS, building products, and finance led me to this opportunity where I get to work on artificial intelligence for mergers and acquisitions and deal making. And I'm working now on building software for the biggest sellers and buyers in the world when they're buying billion-dollar companies. It's a really cool challenge. And I wouldn't be able to do that if I didn't have the background in knowing how to sell, or finance from an education perspective, or SaaS from when I was building multi-tenant SaaS companies 15 years ago, and we were doing when I was doing hybrid cloud and cloud solution 10 years ago. So everything builds on each other, and I think I encourage people to make sure they get out and learn and try new things.
If we go and try to spot trend in AI today, we are either entrepreneur or corporate investment officials or strategy officials are trying to think, what is my direction? How we go about spotting trends in AI, and what have you done in that area?
I obviously go talk with a lot of startups and a lot of disruptors to see what are they working on. That's my first place I go. The second place I go is I actually look a lot at research and some of the research coming out of some of the bigger labs and lab partnerships in this particular space. So what you find is, for example, one trend that I'm really excited about is the amount of automation that's happening in AI development. So I think part of that is a response to the shortage of talent in the marketplace. A part of it's also building on terms of cloud technologies and cloud automation. And part of it is this idea that we're able to begin tackling more complex knowledge domains, more complex problems with AI, and automation makes that so much faster. So I would, for example, take a look at things like transfer learning. Some of the transfer learning technologies at this point are being combined with a number of automation techniques that let you automate the choice of algorithm and then transfer learning from base models to create new models in just a few hours. And sometimes you can actually do this without even a developer in the path. You can actually see certain cases where a subject matter expert can do some of their own model development. And there's some rich interaction happening with business intelligence, where business intelligence is actually evolving to be lined up and integrated more with these models that people can build on their own. So there's some really powerful things happening. And when you're a new entrepreneur or you're starting out, you have to be aware that I think half of the team and half of your efforts need to be in partners in the ecosystem, and half need to be building your own technology. Otherwise, if you just try to build everything yourself, or you just go to pure open source without partners, you're going to miss out on some of these evolutions. And this stuff is changing every year. So the things you knew a year ago, you want to keep up to date on those, because the investments are just so large that you'll miss out if you don't have partners.
Can you give us some example of things that you've seen?
I don't know if I can say their name publicly, but I've been previewing some technology with a startup in Israel that actually does a combination of curated public data sets with private data sets. And then they essentially they've created a framework that runs through all of the standard libraries that you would find in open source, and essentially gives you the statistical, those with the best statistical returns in a few clicks. So what that actually does for me is it lets me say, okay, when I look at these two pieces of data, I can actually get some statistically valid values when I apply these libraries, and I can actually go look at the data and very rapidly go through and create more advanced models from that. And I can do that without being an expert and without knowing every single library. So that's one, and there's a few of those. If you want to look at maybe some of the bigger work, I would actually take a look at some of the work that's being done in Watson Discovery. So when you actually think about Watson, the interesting thing that you have to remember is IBM's been working with physicians for the last 5 years. And a lot of their technologies are built to make it easier for subject matter experts to build models. And what they're doing, which is a little bit unique, is they're a SaaS business. Their approach is SaaS for how they implement AI. So I think some of the tooling there, what I've seen is in the past, we've actually been able to build models for NLP enrichments for doing entity recognition in about 15 hours without any developers in the pipeline. So I can actually bring up a set of documents, I can do annotations, and I can publish a model to an API without a developer. And it's that integrated tooling. Microsoft has something very similar, for example. That's really powerful when I can put an expert in front of a set of documents, do some annotations, and all of a sudden I can quickly have a model that will do entity recognition on a topic. Let's say it's energy distribution, supply chains, things like that.
Super interesting. And I had to ask you another bad question, which is, okay, we have identified the trend. We have identified some recipes for success, which is basically partnership. And how do we go about building a product?
Yeah, so a few things. The first is when you're using partners and building your own technology, it's really important to understand what's going to be your intellectual property and what's going to be something you license and buy. And make sure that when you're building your product that you actually are building on something you own where the real value is. So the example might be that if you have a bunch of documents and you need to get some structured data, use some of these partner technologies to get you some of the structured data and really build and own the models that create the new value. That's a good example. So follow the normal product recipe of understand your market and your competition, really, really, really understand your market problem and your market need. Use design thinking if you have the opportunity. And the reason I say that is understanding the journey map and the pain points that people have and really their emotional state through that journey is really important, because what a lot of people end up doing is they say, well, there's so much I could do with AI. You may not actually need to do everything. So we work with a lot of analysts who build financial models in Excel, and you could theoretically build better models or different types of models using AI technologies. But that's actually the art of what they like to do, so they're happiest in that process. What they don't like to do, for example, is maybe do some organization of content or identifying where data is in times of lots of data. So those are things we can augment to do a little bit better and make their work more efficient, but not take away from the thing that makes them happiest. So understanding when you say we're going to assist people in, that's what our product does, then it's make sure you understand that journey. And if you're going to automate something, make sure you really understand the value. So a lot of people don't take the time to really understand how valuable is automation of something, because what you want to do is a value-based pricing of whatever it is that you're automating. And an example is there's a lot of vendors right now and startups who are making new products to automate human tasks. And there's a pretty good recipe that's pretty typical for taking time and the value of that time and selling it as software. And you can easily underprice yourself or overprice yourself. The third part is make sure that you actually understand, do you own the data? Do you have rights to use the data? And then how much work is it actually going to be to do all of the collection, the munging, and all the labeling of that data? So for example, in a few of the cases I've worked on, we're working with very senior people who are very expensive. So it takes actually a lot of duration for us to do some of the labeling and some of the annotations, but and we have to do a lot of work because we only get maybe an hour or two with these subject matter experts. And we tend to be focusing a lot on the design of how do we get the implicit data from when people are using these applications that we're building to actually further develop our models, or even in many times automate a lot of the creation of our models.
Before we move on, I like to expand on the getting the value proposition right. So let me summarize what I got from what you're saying. The first thing is getting the end-to-end process where you're spotting the problem, and so getting the customer journey. Second is getting the magnitude, if you like, of the specific problem you're trying to solve. Is it an important problem? Is not? How important is for the user? Third is, what is the emotional element attached to solving that problem, or how the problem should be solved, taking into account the emotional element of the person. Now, you're saying lots of people get this wrong, and there is a reason for it, which is basically it's a difficult aspect in the process. Finding out that information and finding them out correctly is difficult, takes time, reaching out people and inquiring them in the right way. How do you accomplish that part?
I've built about 8 of these types of products this way. And the best thing I can tell you is go speak with people about what it is you're doing. When you read a book like Crossing the Chasm and they show the normal product lifecycle adoption curve, what a lot of people forget is that there's a set of personalities and buyers that map along that curve. And the people at the very front of that curve, they want to be involved in product development and in advancing their field. They have a passion. And if you can find those people and engage them in the right way, you'll be very, very successful. In particular, as you build your product with them and you're rapidly putting, prototypes and working systems in front of them to get their feedback, that process, when you identify those right people, those people become the champions that later on are the people who convince the early adopters, for example, to buy your product, and the mainstream adopters to buy your product. The second part is it's really easy to do this with a couple, 2, 3, 4 people. But when you actually get to bigger teams that are globally distributed, it's really important that you capture that information and that you summarize it in the right way. So use, where you can, a lot of recordings, and use a lot of the standard tools that are out there. There's a reason that people invented personas or they invented journey maps. Those things are ways to distill information that's pretty complicated into something that everybody can understand and use and benefit from. And it's something that's many times easy to ignore, but when you actually use them and you do them well, they become very, very powerful tools. And they pay dividends later on, because what you want to do is you want to be lean in how you approach things. You want to always do small iterations. And when you get all of this information from an expert, for example, what you want to be able to say is, I'm confident that I don't need to build this feature right now. I can build this feature. I can build this feature later. And then you can also say, this is a low effort, high value feature, or a high value, high effort feature, or a high value, high effort, low value feature. And that grid that you can build, it really helps you decide, what should I buy? What should I build? What's the right mix for me at this stage in time? And honestly, just getting that right community of people is invaluable in the very beginning. And it's find the people who are interested in the evolution of this market. Ask them for their assistance. And you don't need a lot of time. You'd be surprised that 5 to 10 people with 4 to 8 hours over a 3 or 4 month period from each of them is a substantial amount of time. For you, it's a little bit of time from them, and you'll learn a massive amount.
I think these are very interesting insights, particularly when we come to the quantification of how much effort is needed, because often people get scared about, so how am I going to go about really find out all these things? And there is another part which is about the questions that you ask, but let's go back into what should somebody that is building a product in AI take particular care of?
If you think about the fact that the amount of new products that fail is quite high, and then you take into account the fact that about 60%, 50 to 60%, depending on where you get your data from, of models never make it into production, there's a lot of wasted effort many times. And what you want to go in is be very specific with what it is you're trying to build, and very clear on why you're trying to build it. And I think that's your starting point. And what I would say is, best thing is to break things down into 3 steps before you actually build your model. So the first step is make sure you've had that initial discovery where you've understood the dimensions of the problem. The second is make sure you've gone through the ideation and you've built, for example, simple storyboards that say, this is how we could solve your problem based on what we've heard. And that simple act of just building a storyboard will give you so much information and so much good direction. And I'll give you an example is I do a lot of NLP, and with entity recognition and then extraction, you can go quite far into automation. And what the question we are always having to ask ourselves is, do they really need us to recognize and extract that data? And then once we've extracted it and it's in a format that is structured, how do they want us to visualize it? And you can quickly imagine that you can go from unstructured documents with tables on them to rich dashboarding technology in theory, but that's a ton of work. And is it really what I need? And what I found in some cases is they actually need just to know where the information is, or they want some light visuals. They don't want dashboarding technology, which is what we're used to with more prescriptive or predictive analytics. So that storyboard really helped me make that decision way before I wrote any kind of code. And then the third, I would just make sure you've technically proven what you can do. So there are a lot of libraries out there. There's a lot of ways to solve different problems. And in my experience, having a public data set that you have the rights to use can go a long way into helping you understand the 5, 6, 8, 10 ways of solving a problem and deciding this is the most cost effective, or this is the most high volume, or this is the most accurate in terms of approaches, because there are a lot of trade-offs in how you solve the technical aspect of the problem. And sometimes you need to work with different people in different ways to try and solve a problem. And then you can get into the normal types of prototyping and rapid development. They set you on the right course in the beginning, because if you're really far off from where you need to go in the beginning, you're going to be quite a far off when you actually get through development. And you're going to be one of those products that doesn't do well. And throughout this entire process, go back to earlier where I was talking about those 5 to 10 champions, make them part of that process, have them give their input. They're the ones who give you input on the storyboards. They're the ones who look at the early prototypes.
Have you had a situation where actually you couldn't solve the problem, at least you couldn't solve the problem easily, and you had lots of delay in that, and what was learned?
One of the areas that I've had the problem with is in terms of actually what libraries can you use and what vendors can you use. When you're working with confidential data, where you send your data, how you send it, the cost to actually process that data. The issues were actually, we would find, for example, a great technology, but the technology was licensed on a price, time for value type of approach, where we are actually a high volume, low value type of need. So we actually couldn't use a piece of technology for business reasons. I've also seen where we had people solve, for example, problems with search approaches when we actually needed machine learning approaches. It wasn't fundamentally a search problem, but because of how we explained it, we actually, when we first started, they were solving the problem with, similar to a search problem, not to an assisted machine learning problem. So make sure you understand the business of the external libraries you're using and the licensing restrictions. And then make sure you understand, I think, as a product person, how the problem's getting solved, because in my case, I wasn't trying to solve, I was trying to create a general recipe, for example, to build classification technology or NER technology. And what I cared about was having a good proof of concept and making sure we could build something. But I was actually looking at building 400 or 500 of these, not just 1 or 2. And so the elements of, like, how do I run them multi-tenant? How do I scale them? How do I do them rapidly and repeatedly for different subject areas? I couldn't have a bespoke, couldn't have bespoke solutions as much as maybe others might. So for me, it was as much about the way we were solving the problem, but also the business conditions around how we solve the problem. And those are all going to be unique to the business you're in. What I would say is I feel like where we're coming from in the state of things today is a lot of people like to solve things in a very bespoke way. And there are now a lot of trends towards explainability of models and repeatability of how you do things, like do annotations, for example, in NLP. Those things become really important as you work in more regulated spaces or places where you might have restrictions on the kind of libraries you can use.
So for our audience first, Michael is working on a product that is used in the M&A space. And basically every single case here is a little bit different. So this is an application of machine learning that is not mainstream. It's not like Google trying to recognize images, cat and dog, there are millions of them. This is an application where every single case has some element of being very specific, and you need some level of specific data around that. That's where the human expert come into play. And what we're really doing here, if I understand it correctly, is to create an alliance, a human-machine, where the machine helps the human doing the work quicker. And these humans basically are the M&A professionals that are paid quite a bit. So I'd like to take your viewpoint on the human-machine relationship. Where it's going? What do you think is important? And just some snippets of your personal experience in this area.
Understanding your users and where they're coming from is really important. So when you think about, people say that AI is there to augment or assist the user and make their in a professional capacity, make their jobs faster. That's really vague. And what you want to fundamentally ask yourself when you start is, where's your industry in terms of adoption, and how risky are the assistance features that you're building to what that person is doing? And I'll give you a simple example. If you look at, for example, what's being done in Excel or PowerPoint or Gmail in terms of automation and AI assistance, it's very subtle and you don't even necessarily know that it's there. It's just another set of features. So when PowerPoint auto-suggests a design, or when Gmail is automatically predicting text that you should write and you can hit tab and it will complete a sentence for you, that's great. It's very low risk, first of all. And second of all, it's well integrated into the feature set. When you think about a professional and you think about, let's say, a physician or a finance person, they use medical imaging or they use Excel and they're very detailed. Or you think about maybe a quant and all of the types of visualization that they do. So the UX, the context of where they're coming from is important. And then the weight of the decision is also very important. So what we've noticed is that there are really two things. The first is that the depth versus the width of some of the UX and HCI and the human computer interface that we're looking at are open questions for us that we have to get our input from our users on, because people that use finance and quants, for example, they do a lot with very detailed UX, whereas some of the emerging patterns are much shallower sets of design and much deeper sets of features for AI assistance. And there's a fundamental question: is that right for your expert? So I guess I'm talking in the context of an expert type of user type. The second thing is what is being done by the AI and what's being done manually by a person. So in our case, we're working on high value transactions. I would hypothesize for a physician, it might actually be similar, where they're working on diagnosis of some type. And so the risk is actually quite high that you could automate something incorrectly. So in our case, there's a little bit more formality around what's the AI actually doing. How do we build those scores and an understanding of what the system's actually guiding you and advising you to do? And then how do we actually make sure that we either release liability to the customer, or we're actually following the regulatory laws, because there are some laws which you're not actually allowed to have automation or have a computer give advice, for example. So those aspects are also really critical. And it means that your design actually does have to go through some reviews with some subject matter experts that might be from legal or from compliance. And in our case, and in I think many cases, you may actually want to work with regulators ahead of time. They can be very open and friendly when you actually are working on a new issue that's in a regulated space, and you're coming into the market and saying, we want to, we're a leader in such and such a market, and we want to bring AI technology into that market. Working with regulators and the standards bodies to understand what would be okay, what would not be okay. Those are important steps in the process. And they have the added benefit of establishing you also sometimes as a leader in a particular space. So there's an element here of also the opportunity that you get by being innovative, involving a little broader set of constituents besides just the user and the AI system into some of these questions. And I'm not saying these are necessarily fundamental design questions, but they can be a point where you can establish small sets of patterns or more broad sweeping pieces that are very interesting. I would say that high fidelity planning and prototyping is important, especially with, as I said, some of the implicit and explicit data you want to capture for the feedback loops and the maintenance of this stuff, of these models. Sometimes hard for teams that maybe haven't done this before, which is something I've worked on quite a bit, that you actually need to design these feedback loops and the data feeds into your designs early, so that you have users that are both happy with the user experience, and you have a way to actually build and or improve the models that you've developed.
So this is, very interesting and also unique content. For the first time today, we are really taking a look at the methodology of building an AI product. I think we've got lots of insights at various different levels, from what is risky, how we do the research, and how the human computer interaction should be planned, executed, and also evolved over time. Before I thank you, I want to thank our audience for being here. If you're interested in this content and you want to ask some questions, please comment below. If you have additional requests for content that you'd like to hear, please comment below or reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to research other guests that might be interesting for you. And for the time being, Michael, it was a great pleasure having you here, and thank you so much for being at Conversations in Artificial Intelligence.
Thank you so much. This was great. I appreciate it.